Lena's traditional thing you've seen, it's probably not that. And if we're talking about it online, we were drawn back to William Gibson and the Neuromancer, and the line in it, "The sky above the port was the colour of television turned to the dead." So it's interesting, we adopted Gibson's notion of cyberspace, but the actual dead channel he's talking about literally was inhabited by the dead. We've used that term to represent the digital world, but in many respects he talked about it being inhabited by the dead. And in many respects the internet has become inhabited by the dead, and the whole genre of his work goes through that. And so we thought of maybe using this kind of science fiction as a lens, and thinking about how that lens, science fiction, is impacting on potential visions of the future. And there's a long history of kind of linkages. You know, it's well known that kind of Motorola made their first phone look like the Star Trek communicator and adapted it from Star Trek. I think probably what's more interesting is the current trend of using science within films to create diegetic prototypes. So they use visions of the future as part of this to make the world believable. And it's no coincidence that NASA worked heavily on the Martian, because they've got trying to in 2030. So it becomes a kind of diegetic prototype of giving a vision of the rituals of the future. And so that when we're looking at these genres, we can think of them in terms of predented futures that we may ultimately start to believe in. And it was interesting, Linda was talking about rituals and how some of the rituals around death are using almost promotional type activities for the launch of a new prototype piece of technology. So arguably I would say there's strong linkages there, and traditionally kind of companies often use this kind of vision of the future of everything's up and to the right, which business is like. And they talk about probable and plausible and possible futures. So in essence, everything is potentially possible. Some things are more plausible and others, and arguably in the new future, some things get probable. Our view of plausibility often comes from familiarity, and which is what this graph largely ignores. It takes no account of the present and what we understand. And arguably a more useful thing is actually everything's about the present. Visions of the future tell us more about the present than they really do about the future. They're visions of possibilities, but they don't really tell us a great deal. There's a great fuss made about Back to the Future and what actually came true. It tells you more about when the film was made than it actually does about the future that it predicted. And so there's this constant interplay in the present with history, reality, and here we're just going to really concentrate on fiction. And fiction plays a role in that, our understanding of the world, I would argue. And I'm going to divide it out. I could pick countless examples, but I just want to go over a few that cover kind of, I've split arbitrarily between mind and body. And this one is the notion of cryonics. One of the first examples was kind of Boris Karloff film with The Man with Knife Eyes, which is kind of a crime whodunit where everybody's found frozen, and it turns out it was Boris Karloff. But it linked into a lot of science of the day about freezing human beings, and whether that freezing of the body could actually be a preservation. And they were drawing from notions that in the animal world, things like the Alaskan wood frog, which in the winter while frozen, the frog stops breathing, its heart stops beating, its blood stops flowing, and it cannot move. And in spring it thaws out and returns to normal life. There's a kind of glorious rebirth that is present within that frog that actually, in many respects, is what cryonics is trying to tap into. In terms of cryonics is a real business. This is Alcor in the US. These are the actual prices that you can do. So you can get your whole body cryo preserved for $200,000. If you want the cheap option, then you just get your head done, which is that neuro cryo preservation. So in essence, when we create these visions of the future, there are people who will see it as a business opportunity, and then these futures may ultimately come to pass. So we shouldn't treat them merely as a fictional work. They have a kind of tangibility that presents visions within it. When I talk about heads, I'm always struck by this thing from kind of Futurama, because nobody ever explores what you do afterwards. And so this is the Hall of Presidents in Futurama, where Fry gets a job of feeding chow food to the ex-presidents. And this is a very kind of whimsical take on what might happen. But I came across this in the Guardian last year, around the time we were talking about face transplants. It was the proposal of an Italian doctor to do full head transplants. And it's the notion of what we do with our bodies and how they become preserved that people are exploring whether we think that's right or not. Which presents some really interesting kind of things of what, if we can challenge these kind of narratives, particularly as designers. This is another one. This is from a science fiction short story which was called Brightsicles, which was later done into Love Minus 80, and this was the notion that actually this is becoming something that a power relationship where if you can afford to be frozen, you can be frozen, but many people can't. And the notion is here that generally attractive women who might have a condition can choose to get themselves frozen in the hope that some rich man will unfreeze them, and hence the term Brightsicles. Which raises really interesting issues, and there's a slight, I'm not sure.
People think that when you're in the minus 80, in that cold, cold place between life and death, they think that it's peaceful, like being asleep. But it's not like that. When you're in the minus 80, you're just gone. No thoughts, no dreams, nothing. You're nothing unless someone decides to wake you up, pull you back into existence, give you a second chance at life, at love. Back in the 21st century, they used to say, "Till death do us part." Not anymore, though. Because now, for some of us, death is only the beginning.
So that's about an interesting vision of the future of what this might mean. Whether it's representative remains to be seen, but it presents some interesting ways of thinking about what prior preservation does and who it's for. The second thing I thought I would look at was in terms of the mind, and particularly its now kind of relationship with artificial intelligence, and picking out this comment from Ray Kurzweil, who's engineering director at Google, who coincidentally has said he will freeze his head in Alcor, as has Donald Trump. But I'm not sure it's kind of a good move. But he talks about this technological singularity when a predictive point in development of civilization where progress accelerates beyond our ability to understand it. And it's this notion of intelligence and the mind that for me is kind of really interesting in terms. And this is a clip from Be Right Back from Black Brimmer, which was a science fiction thing that explored the notions of death. So this is Martha, and she moves into a new house with her husband, and during the move her husband's killed taking the van back. And her friend introduces her to a service that will reanimate her husband through artificial intelligence, and she has ongoing conversations with her husband. Part of the trauma is that she finds out she's pregnant, and so she uses this artificial intelligence, and ultimately she can reanimate that into her body. After a while she kind of finds the kind of reanimation creepy, so she locks him in the attic. But if you see it, it's well worth a visit, but it opens up that interesting notion of what we preserve and how we preserve it, and whether we can reanimate ourselves from all the information that we ultimately store. Again, this sounds far-fetched, but this is a company that's in Silicon Valley that's offering this service, or the potential future of this service, called human resurrection through artificial intelligence. So we talk about these things as if they're fanciful and nobody will ever take them seriously, but people see business opportunities in them, and ultimately these commercial drivers become potentials for this. The beginning is near. If you want to transplant your brain into an elegantly designed bionic body called Humine, which is the very almost plot driven from that episode of Black Mirror, rather frightening. So we see these worlds appearing before us, and it becomes questionable what to do. On a slightly different note is the notion of, if we're extending life, what effect does it have on the mind? And this is the character Ishilda, which appeared in kind of Doctor Who, and she's Viking shield maiden who's given a kind of alien thing that kind of keeps her body alive forever, and she exists forever, but she can't cope mentally with that constant thing, and her memories become lessened. She can't remember everything. So she eventually chooses to call herself just me, and the only memories she uses are the ones she writes down. And it's whether, yes, we extend our times, but will our brains cope with that extension? And that's something many neuroscientists can't answer. If we keep extending these things, what will happen? In terms of how we properly alter different narratives, then speculative design offers an opportunity, and this is this notion that we try and look at technological emergence and predicts future when those technologies become mundane or everyday. And in essence, that's what those particular science fiction things are doing. They've projected technologies and have introduced them into the mundanity of everyday life so that they do become more plausible and believable. And can we do this in other ways? And there are a few, but not kind of overly many examples. So one that, and this, before I say that, this builds on a long tradition of design of projecting the future. So this is Mel Geddes' Futurama from the 1939 World Fair. And this arguably introduced America to the notion of a car-driven culture and cities laid out in plain. You sat in this kind of booth, and then it moved round, and it gave you that flyover feel that feels very knowledgeable today, but it presented this a future driven by the automobile, but arguably projected what Americans did in terms of their society. It's a car-driven cities and a car-driven culture, and that appeared in Mel Geddes way before we started to see that actually coming to life. So it's an interesting way that design has always projected the future. Microsoft produces countless future videos, and they're trying to bring in the notion that these things will come to pass. Minority Report probably did arguably more for the sales of Wii and Move than any other terms, in terms of they brought the notion of gesture to reality. So these things have an impact within our views of the world. This is an example for James Auger and Jimmy Loiseau's, and it's called Afterlife, and this is exploring the notion of microbial decomposition of bodies, and thinking about mortality and the body and how we might use that energy it creates rather than waste it into life. So in this, it's essentially, it turns the bodies into a battery charger. I don't know if you can see it on things. It says a torch to light your way, and it has the name of the deceased on the battery and that kind of things. So it presents a different view of the way we try to treat bodies and the ritualistic practices that might come to that. So that design can offer different pictures of the world, or different potential futures of death. And rather than reacting to necessarily what we see, then we can react to offer alternatives that might open up the discourse a bit broader. On a final note, I will leave you with these images from the end of Nina's thesis, which argues that rather than being human-centric, there are bigger questions about death in terms of the planet, and that ultimate legacy will be in the radio waves and the television waves we send into space, and our society will exist in the kind of ashes of a more apocalyptic vision, which offers an alternative that we may think is that, yes, we're creating all these memorials, but is that the biggest problem that we have? It's a question. And I will take any that turns. I'm not sure how long I've done.